The morning in Moscow was colder than usual, a biting wind sweeping across Red Square and carrying with it the weight of history. Inside the Kremlin's fortified strategy room, behind thick blast doors and walls lined with electronic counter-surveillance devices, the Russian president sat in silence. Vladimir Putin's expression was unreadable, his gaze fixed on a massive digital display projecting maps of Europe and the North Atlantic. Every NATO installation, every U.S. carrier strike group position, every logistical supply route from America to Europe, all of it illuminated in sharp red lines and pulsing icons. Around him, a half-circle of the most trusted military and intelligence chiefs stood at rigid attention. The chief of the general staff, his uniform immaculate and adorned with rows of service ribbons, adjusted his glasses as he spoke in a low voice. "Comrade President, our strategic readiness level is at maximum. Northern Fleet submarines are on silent patrol. The Yars and Sarmat missile regiments are on alert. Cyber units are standing by for activation. We can begin at your order." For over a decade, Russia had been preparing for this moment. Since 2014, after sanctions and geopolitical isolation, it had poured billions into rebuilding its armed forces, modernizing its nuclear triad, and reorienting its doctrine toward asymmetric and hybrid warfare. The Kremlin had shifted from being a regional power to a strategic challenger of the United States and its NATO allies. Belarus had been folded into its military planning. Syria provided a forward outpost for influence in the Middle East, and covert technology and energy deals tied it closer to Iran. Russia had also invested in game-changing weapons. Hypersonic glide vehicles, advanced submarine-launched nuclear drones like Poseidon, and integrated anti-access area denial A2AD systems designed to lock NATO forces out of contested zones. The mood in the room was heavy, a palpable silence broken only by the faint hum of the projection screens. Every man and woman there understood the gravity of the decision being contemplated. It was not a limited conflict. It was not a proxy war. It was the unthinkable, a direct strike designed to challenge U.S. dominance and permanently alter the balance of power in the 21st century. One advisor, a veteran of Russia's cyber command, tapped a stylus on his tablet. "We strike in layers. First, cyber. We paralyze their infrastructure, blind their satellites, disrupt their GPS. Then hypersonic strikes on European NATO bases to sever U.S. forward presence. Finally, a blockade of the Atlantic shipping lanes with our submarines. If we can cut their lifeline and take Europe quickly, America will hesitate to escalate." Another general added, "We have the advantage of geography, and our new Zircon missiles outrun any American interceptor. If they hesitate even for a day, we control the tempo of the war." Putin leaned forward, hands clasped, eyes cold. For years, he had warned the West not to encircle Russia with missile shields and forward bases. For years, those warnings had been ignored. Now, he believed, history had provided an opportunity. Or perhaps a necessity. And so, the unspoken question hangs in the air, one that should chill anyone hearing it. What if Russia decided to attack the United States and NATO today, in a full-scale modern war? Hour by hour, how would that unfold, and who would lose? This is not a fantasy or science fiction story. This is a realistic war scenario, based on real weapons, real military doctrines, and the terrifying escalation of modern warfare. From brutal cyber warfare to unstoppable hypersonic missile attacks, from fierce naval battles in the Atlantic to the terrifying brink of nuclear annihilation, this scenario plays out as if tomorrow's headlines have arrived early. Follow along with us to the end of this rare step-by-step war analysis video, as we take you into a world few dare to imagine, but which could, at some unfortunate moment, become a terrifying reality. Leave a comment on your favorite weapon. At 0400 o'clock Moscow time, the room fell silent as President Vladimir Putin gave a simple nod. That was all it took. A decade of preparation and one whispered word, not chat. Commence. Unleashed the largest coordinated attack against the United States and NATO since World War II. The first blows were invisible. Screens flickered in U.S. hospitals along the East Coast. Rail control systems in Poland and Germany froze, trapping supply trains loaded with American tanks. 1,000 miles away, a container ship in the port of New York had its navigation controls hijacked, veering dangerously close to a pier before power cut out entirely. Russia's cyber warfare units, notably the GRU's infamous Sandworm group, had been lying dormant inside Western networks for months, perhaps years, waiting for this exact moment. Within the first hour, American infrastructure groaned under the weight of the digital assault. Power grids, sections of New England and New York lost electricity as industrial control systems shut down. Air traffic control, East Coast radar coverage went dark for 6 terrifying minutes, grounding flights across Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, and Boston. Banking networks, algorithmic trades halted on Wall Street, triggering automated fail-safe protocols to prevent a collapse. For the public, it felt like an intense but temporary outage. For U.S. Strategic Command, it was a nightmare. "This isn't random," one general muttered in Omaha, Nebraska, where America's nuclear forces are directed. "This is coordinated warfare." NATO's response teams attempted to isolate infected servers and reroute communications. But the Russians had anticipated these defensive measures, employing advanced persistent threats, APTs, that attacked backup systems as soon as they came online. It was a digital blitzkrieg, carefully sequenced to buy Russia 3 critical hours of uncontested initiative. At 05:15 Moscow time, 22:15 EST, a second, more visible phase began. From airfields in western Russia, MiG-31K interceptors climbed to high altitude, each carrying a single Kh-47M2 Kinjal hypersonic missile. Capable of reaching Mach 10 and maneuvering mid-flight, these missiles were virtually unstoppable by existing NATO air defense systems. Their targets: U.S. air bases in Germany, Poland, and Norway, the logistical lifelines for American forces deployed in Europe. Simultaneously, Admiral Gorshkov-class frigates stationed in the Barents and Baltic Seas launched Caliber cruise missiles at key radar installations and command centers. In the Black Sea, a submerged Yasen-class submarine fired a salvo toward the Mediterranean, targeting NATO logistics hubs in Italy. On radar screens in Ramstein Air Base, Germany, hundreds of fast-moving blips appeared. Sirens wailed as Patriot missile batteries spooled up to intercept. In a matter of minutes, explosions lit the night sky. The Patriot systems managed to knock out a handful of Caliber missiles, but were overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Spangdahlem Air Base in Germany took 2 direct hits, destroying fuel depots and grounding F-16 squadrons. A logistics center in Riga, Norway, burned after a Kinjal strike, cutting off airlift operations to the Baltic states. Multiple NATO satellites reported temporary jamming, likely from Russian ground-based Krasuka-4 electronic warfare systems. While the missiles flew, Russian ground forces executed the third part of the plan, locking NATO out of Eastern Europe. S-400 and S-500 missile defense systems along the Russian and Belarusian borders activated, creating a no-fly zone extending hundreds of miles into Eastern Europe. NATO aircraft approaching these zones risked immediate destruction. Meanwhile, Baltic Fleet corvettes moved from Kaliningrad under heavy electronic countermeasure cover, laying mines along key shipping routes. Russian Northern Fleet submarines, Bore-class ballistic missile boats, and Yasen-class attack subs slipped beneath the Arctic ice, their presence designed to threaten transatlantic supply lines. In Washington, the National Security Council convened in the Situation Room. The U.S. president, surrounded by generals and intelligence analysts, faced a chilling report. Dozens of NATO bases hit within the first 2 hours, partial failure of missile defense in Europe. Widespread cyber disruptions crippling logistics and civilian morale. "Are we under nuclear attack?" the president demanded. "No, sir," answered the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. "All incoming are conventional. For now." Picture the chaos. European skies glowing with streaks of missile trails, fireballs erupting at airfields, and cyber command centers filled with frenzied operators trying to shut down malware spreading like wildfire. In Moscow, Putin watched stoically as his generals reported success, while on NATO's side, commanders struggled to regain operational control. This opening strike wasn't designed to defeat the United States outright. It aimed to paralyze NATO, isolate U.S. forces in Europe, and gain enough time for Russia to launch follow-up offensives, possibly even in the Arctic or the Baltics, before Washington could mount a coordinated counterattack. The clock was ticking. The world had just entered a new era of warfare, one fought simultaneously in cyberspace, the skies, and the deep oceans, with no declaration, no warning, and no chance to back away. Dawn broke over Europe with the sound of sirens and the haze of smoke rising from NATO bases still burning from the night before. Civilian news networks showed chaotic images: shattered airport terminals in Poland, blacked-out neighborhoods in Germany, and convoys of refugees leaving Baltic cities. The Russian plan was clear: paralyze NATO logistics and isolate the eastern flank before a counterattack could be mounted. In eastern Ukraine, Russian mechanized units surged forward. T-90M tanks and BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicles rolled past defensive trenches, spearheaded by electronic warfare units that jammed communications on NATO frequencies. Belarusian forces, now officially mobilized under Moscow's command, pushed south and west, threatening to sever the Suwalki Gap, the thin NATO corridor connecting Poland to the Baltic states. If that gap closed, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia would be effectively cut off. By mid-morning, the Russian First Guards tank army had reached the outskirts of Kharkiv, not to occupy the city permanently, but to draw NATO ground units away from the Baltic region. It was a diversion, and NATO commanders knew it. But they could not ignore the scale of the offensive. Russian long-range aviation dominated the skies. Two 160M strategic bombers, operating from deep inside Russian territory, launched waves of Ka-101 cruise missiles targeting NATO radar stations and command hubs in Norway and the UK. Despite NATO's integrated air defense network, some missiles slipped through, disabling early warning systems for critical hours. On the ground, Russian S-400 and S-500 air defense systems created a lethal anti-access bubble over much of Eastern Europe. NATO fighter pilots reported lock-on warnings the moment they approached contested airspace. Even the stealthy F-35s were forced to take extreme precautions, relying on standoff weapons rather than close engagements. Far to the west, the war at sea began in earnest. Russia's northern fleet surged into the Norwegian Sea, deploying its most advanced submarines. Borei-class ballistic missile subs disappeared under the Arctic ice, while Yasen-class attack subs hunted NATO shipping lanes like predators in the deep. Their mission? Cut off America's transatlantic reinforcement routes before they could reach Europe. The first major naval clash occurred 200 miles west of Iceland, when a Russian Yasen-class submarine torpedoed a U.S. fast sealift ship carrying Abrams tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles. The strike killed 31 sailors and sent shockwaves through NATO logistics planning. Adding to the chaos, intelligence reports suggested that Russia had activated its most terrifying naval asset, the Poseidon nuclear-powered torpedo drone. Its rumored capability, a 100-megaton nuclear warhead designed to create coastal tsunamis, terrified U.S. East Coast cities and forced the U.S. Navy to divert destroyers from convoy protection to coastal defense. Whether Poseidon had actually deployed or not was irrelevant. Its mere mention had already altered U.S. naval priorities. In European capitals, panic set in. Internet outages and power failures spread as Russian cyber units exploited critical infrastructure vulnerabilities. Supermarkets in Warsaw and Berlin emptied within hours as residents prepared for the worst. Gas prices spiked as pipelines feeding Europe were shut down for security reasons, driving energy markets into turmoil. Global markets convulsed. Oil surged past $150 a barrel, gold prices soared, and Asian stock markets plunged as shipping insurance rates tripled for any route passing near the conflict zone. The world understood. This was no localized skirmish. It was a tectonic shock to the global system. Inside NATO's Brussels headquarters, commanders scrambled to assess the damage. Article 5 had been formally invoked, but assembling a coordinated counterattack was proving difficult. Many European forces were still mobilizing, and logistics bottlenecks grew worse by the hour. The United States rushed additional carrier strike groups toward the Atlantic, but their arrival would take days. In the meantime, NATO relied on rapid reaction forces. British Royal Marines airlifted to defend Estonia, French Rafale jets repositioned to protect Baltic airspace, and U.S. Special Operations Forces deployed to reinforce vulnerable communication hubs. Yet even as NATO rallied, Russia achieved a key strategic effect: time. Those first 48 hours gave Moscow freedom to dictate the pace of battle, moving troops and naval assets unopposed in key theaters. Picture it: flames rising from a shattered German airbase as ambulances weave between craters, a Norwegian frigate steaming through icy waters, sonar pinging for lurking submarines. a Baltic highway choked with civilian cars and military convoys heading in opposite directions. And in the Kremlin, Putin watches stoically as new pins are placed on a digital map, expanding Russia's zone of control. The West was reeling, and the question looming over every situation room and command center was stark. Had the war already been lost in its first 2 days? By the third day of war, the shock of Russia's opening strike had given way to grim determination. In Brussels, the NATO Council unanimously invoked Article 5 of the Alliance Charter. An attack on one was an attack on all. The words were spoken slowly, but they were world-changing. The U.S. President, flanked by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the NATO Secretary General, appeared on live broadcast. "This is not just an attack on Europe. This is an attack on the rules of global peace. NATO will respond decisively and united." Orders flew across continents. The U.S. Navy activated 2 additional carrier strike groups. USS Gerald R. Ford, CVN-78, steaming from Norfolk toward the Norwegian Sea. USS George H.W. Bush, CVN-77, redirecting from Mediterranean exercises toward the Central Atlantic. The United Kingdom deployed its carrier HMS Queen Elizabeth, loaded with F-35Bs, while France dispatched the Charles de Gaulle battle group. Even smaller NATO navies, such as Canada's Halifax-class frigates and Spain's Álvaro de Bazán-class destroyers, surged toward patrol positions. On land, NATO's Very High Readiness Joint Task Force, VJTF, spearheaded by German Leopard 2. 7 tanks and Polish mechanized brigades began pushing east, aiming to reinforce the vulnerable Suwałki Gap before Russian forces could cut it completely. The U.S. Air Force unleashed a new and largely untested concept: Rapid Dragon. Cargo aircraft, including C-130s and C-17s, dropped pallets of AGM-158 JASSM cruise missiles from high altitude. Within seconds of release, the pallets deployed wings and engines, transforming into precision-guided weapons. In one wave, over 200 missiles struck Russian forward supply hubs, S-400 batteries near Kaliningrad, and bridge crossings in Belarus. Many missiles were intercepted, but enough got through to cause chaos among Russian logistics chains. Electronic warfare and cyber counterstrike. NATO cyber units, assisted by U.S. Cyber Command, retaliated. Russian rail systems were hacked, delaying reinforcements moving west. A malware payload infiltrated an energy control network near St. Petersburg, forcing emergency shutdowns. Though limited, the cyber strikes sent a clear message: Russia no longer held digital supremacy. Naval clash. Greenland-Iceland-UK gap. By day 4, the Greenland-Iceland-UK GUK gap, NATO's traditional choke point for tracking Soviet-era submarines, became a battlefield again. U.S. Virginia-class submarines hunted Russian Yasen-class subs, while P-8 Poseidon patrol aircraft dropped sonobuoys across the region. The first major naval exchange occurred when a U.S. destroyer, USS Arleigh Burke, detected and engaged a Russian sub attempting to torpedo a U.S. supply convoy. After a tense 20-minute chase, the Russian sub was hit by a Mark 48 torpedo. At almost the same moment, NATO lost a British Astute-class submarine to a retaliatory strike. The Atlantic was once again a deadly chessboard, each side hunting the other in cold silence. Air superiority battle. In the skies, NATO regained momentum. American F-35 Lightning IIs and British Eurofighter Typhoons engaged Russian Su-35s and Su-57 stealth fighters over the Baltic. The air war was fierce and costly, but NATO's network-centric warfare, data sharing between jets, AWACS aircraft, and ground stations, allowed it to slowly push Russian air patrols back toward their own territory. Cinematic moment. Turning the tide. Imagine the sequence. A formation of C-17s releasing cruise missile pallets over the North Sea, each splitting off into a swarm of autonomous precision weapons. NATO frigates firing volleys of Standard Missile-6 interceptors to shield convoys carrying tanks and ammunition to Europe. Special operations teams inserting behind Russian lines in the Baltics, laser designating targets for incoming strikes. For the first time since the war began, NATO commanders felt they were dictating the tempo. But Moscow wasn't idle. Russian bombers launched another round of Kh-47M2 Kinzhal hypersonic missiles targeting NATO fuel depots in Poland. One struck Rzeszów Airport, a key hub for U.S. reinforcements, killing dozens and halting transport flights for hours. Even so, Russia's initial momentum was slowing. Ammunition expenditure was high, some units were running low on fuel, and cyber superiority was no longer assured. The Atlantic blockade was leaking, with U.S. convoys now reaching British ports under heavy escort. Families in Europe crowded bomb shelters as air raid sirens wailed nightly. American families watched news footage of body bags returning home. Social media exploded with hashtags like WW3 and Defend Europe, while stock markets continued their freefall. Yet for NATO troops on the ground and sailors at sea, one feeling started to replace despair: resolve. They had survived the opening ambush. Now it was time to push back. 1 week into the war, Russia's lightning strike had lost momentum. The initial shock, cyber paralysis, missile salvos, and rapid ground advances had given Moscow a temporary edge. But war, once drawn out, turns on logistics, industrial capacity, and sheer endurance. Here, the United States and NATO held overwhelming advantages. Russian armored spearheads pushing toward the Suwalki Gap now faced entrenched NATO forces reinforced by German Leopard, 2A7 tanks, Polish Crab self-propelled howitzers, and U.S. Stryker brigades flown in under emergency airlift. Drone footage showed burned-out T-90M tanks littering highways, where HIMARS rocket systems had ambushed advancing columns. The Kremlin's hope of cutting off the Baltic states quickly had failed. Lithuania and Latvia remained linked to NATO supply chains, thanks to Allied engineers working around the clock to repair bridges and rail lines destroyed in earlier strikes. Russia's early control of the skies had evaporated. NATO's E-3AWACS command aircraft and ground-based Patriot and Aegis ashore missile defenses neutralized most of the incoming cruise missiles, while the U.S. Air Force deployed B-2 Spirit stealth bombers to strike Russian airfields near Kaliningrad and western Russia. At sea, NATO submarines and maritime patrol aircraft systematically hunted Russian Yasen-class subs. The U.S. Navy's carrier groups, fully assembled in the Norwegian Sea, began launching continuous sorties of Fa-18 Super Hornets and F-35Cs. Russian surface ships, including 2 Admiral Gorshkov-class frigates and a Slava-class cruiser, were sunk in engagements around the UK Gap. Even Russia's much-feared Poseidon nuclear torpedo deterrence bluff backfired. NATO publicly released sonar tracks showing Poseidon drones still docked in Russian bases, undermining the psychological edge Moscow had tried to wield. Behind the front lines, the economic war hit Russia hard. The U.S. leveraged its control of global financial systems to freeze Russian reserves and choke off trade. European nations, even those historically hesitant to cut energy imports, agreed to a temporary embargo on Russian oil and gas. Russian industry, already under strain from years of sanctions, could not keep up with ammunition expenditure rates. Caliber missile production slowed, and hypersonic missile stocks dwindled. A leaked Russian Ministry of Defense memo revealed critical shortages of tank engines and precision-guided munitions. Inside Russia, cracks appeared. Protests erupted in Moscow and St. Petersburg, despite heavy policing. Long lines formed outside banks as citizens scrambled to withdraw cash amid a collapsing ruble. Military funerals quietly spread across provincial towns, each coffin symbolizing a war effort increasingly unpopular at home. Even among Russia's allies, commitment wavered. Belarusian forces, bloodied in early assaults, pulled back to defensive positions. Iran, though sympathetic, avoided direct military support to prevent drawing U.S. retaliation in the Middle East. Picture a frozen Belarusian field strewn with abandoned Russian vehicles, their turrets blown off by NATO precision artillery. A Polish logistics hub buzzing with activity as ammunition pallets and medical supplies pour in from the U.S. C-17 airlift bridge. In Moscow, tense cabinet meetings with generals silently pointing to charts showing dwindling reserves and expanding NATO territorial control. Moscow had gambled on speed and shock. It underestimated NATO's ability to mobilize, its own industrial weaknesses, and the political unity that Article 5 invoked. By focusing heavily on missile and cyber warfare early, Russia expended high-tech munitions without achieving decisive territorial control. A war designed to last days had dragged into a grinding stalemate, and the advantage was shifting irreversibly. For civilians, both in Europe and Russia, war fatigue set in fast. Refugee flows from contested areas hit 1 million within 10 days. Families in Kaliningrad lined up for food as NATO blockades bit hard. In Ukraine and the Baltics, displaced families camped under tarps, while NATO engineers built field hospitals to handle waves of wounded. For Russian soldiers at the front, morale eroded. Reports circulated of conscripts refusing orders or sabotaging their own equipment to avoid combat. The Russian leadership faced a stark reality. Its war of choice was becoming unwinnable. In Moscow, the atmosphere inside the secure command bunker was unlike any previous meeting. Maps no longer showed arrows of advance, but defensive perimeters retreating toward the Russian border. Ammunition stocks were dangerously low, Baltic offensives stalled, and NATO forces were now pushing into previously contested regions with overwhelming air and naval support. President Vladimir Putin sat silently at the head of the table, listening as his generals outlined the grim reality. 30% of modern tank inventory destroyed. Hypersonic missile reserves at critical minimum. NATO forces establishing air superiority over Kaliningrad and Belarus. Economic collapse accelerating under sanctions and blockades. One voice broke the silence. The commander of Russia's strategic rocket forces. We still have our ultimate equalizer. Iskander-M tactical nuclear missiles are already forward deployed. We can halt NATO's momentum with one decisive strike. The room froze. Everyone understood what that meant. Escalating from conventional warfare to nuclear warfare. NATO's intelligence and DEFCON shift. In Washington, U.S. intelligence confirmed satellite images of Iskander launchers moving into Belarus and Kaliningrad, their warheads loaded and armed. The U.S. Strategic Command immediately raised alert levels to DEFCON 2, one step below full nuclear war. The president met with senior advisors and NATO leaders via secure video link. The advice was unanimous. Show strength, but avoid preemptive nuclear escalation. Prepare retaliation in case Russia crossed the threshold. U.S. Minuteman III, ICBM silos were placed on full alert. B-2 Spirit bombers dispersed to multiple airfields, and Ohio-class submarines repositioned to second strike launch points. Back in Moscow, the debate continued. One general argued, "Without escalation, we lose the war, and perhaps the state itself. NATO will dictate terms." Another countered, "Use nuclear weapons, and we trigger total annihilation. There will be no Russia to defend." Putin, known for calculated risk-taking, stared at the launch authorization folder. His hand hovered but never opened it. After a long pause, he spoke. "We will not be the ones to start Armageddon. Pull back the Iskanders to defensive posture." Picture red-lit missile silos with launch keys in trembling hands, bombers refueling mid-air under an ominous sky, and satellite screens tracking warhead movements in real time. The world held its breath for an hour that felt like an eternity. Then exhaled when Russian nuclear forces stood down. Russia's high-stakes gamble had failed. Its forces, battered and cut off from supply lines, withdrew to pre-war positions. NATO troops secured the Suwalki Gap and reopened all Baltic supply routes. The Russian Navy, once a threat to Atlantic shipping, limped back to port, leaving wreckage scattered across the ocean floor. Diplomatic channels, previously silent, roared back to life. A ceasefire was brokered under heavy international pressure. Russia agreed to withdraw advanced weapon systems from Belarus and accept a UN-monitored demilitarized zone near the Baltic border. In exchange, NATO paused offensive operations inside Russian territory. Tens of thousands lay dead, cities were scarred, and the global economy was shattered. Oil above $180 a barrel, supply chains in chaos, and refugee camps overflowing across Europe. Victory, if it could be called that, came at a price no one wanted to pay again. Modern warfare is no longer just tanks and soldiers. It's cyberattacks, hypersonic strikes, economic collapse, and the looming shadow of nuclear annihilation. Would such a war even have a winner? Or does survival itself become the only prize? What do you think? Could this happen? comment below, and subscribe for more geopolitical war scenarios.